So what's Rachel's second reason to suppose that differences in moral codes between these indigenous people of the circumpolar region and the cultures and societies of Western Europe probably doesn't indicate a difference in the moral value that they place on life? Well, he suggests that the practice doesn't emerge solely from moral values and points to research that suggests that it emerges as a response to harsh conditions and limited resources, not merely moral values. Now, this explanation of why it is that this practice of infanticide emerges, I should note, is consistent with general accounts of why animals commit infanticide, just generally. So in 1984, Hardy and Hosfater published a research paper that suggested 5 motivations for infanticide amongst animals generally. And the first motivation was exploitation of the infant as a resource, usually cannibalism. The second was competition for resources. The third was sexual selection. And the fourth was parental increase of their own lifetime reproductive success by eliminating particular offspring. And the fifth was social pathology. And Hardy and Hosfater, as well as Daly and Wilson, Dickerman, and Scrimshaw, have all documented cases of human infanticide that include examples driven by each of these motivations. So, other factors contribute, at least, to the manifestation of particular practices or moral codes within a society other than moral values. And this is Rachel's point. He wants to argue that it's possible for these cultures to have the same moral values even if they differ in their moral codes or practices, because those practices are determined by other things in addition to their moral values. I'd also note a third reason that Rachel doesn't mention for denying that second and third premise of the descriptive cultural relativist argument, namely that the practice of infanticide has tended to decrease as technology diminishes resource scarcity or mitigates reproductive considerations. It's also tended to decrease when infanticide practicing societies came into contact with societies in which it was prohibited. For example, modern circumpolar indigenous people no longer practice infanticide. So it's not the case that these two cultures have different moral codes with regard to infanticide any longer. Shortly after they came into contact, our moral codes started to come into alignment with one another, which is something that we wouldn't expect given the cultural differences argument. So in Rachel's view, descriptive moral relativism doesn't give one reasons to accept methodological moral relativism. And there are 2 criticisms that he offers up of attempts to establish it, that is, metaethical moral relativism on the basis of descriptive moral relativism. On the one hand, he argues that the truth of descriptive moral relativism isn't sufficient. It doesn't suffice to establish the truth of metaethical moral relativism. So it's an invalid argument to go from descriptive moral relativism to metaethical moral relativism. When you add other premises to try and make those connections, he suggests that those premises are in fact probably false. So he rejects the argument both as logically flawed and as having false premises. That gives us reasons not to conclude that metaethical moral relativism is true given the argument. But it doesn't give us reasons to suppose it's not true or true. It just says we don't have a good reason in this argument to find it to be true. So he wants to bolster the case here by offering up an argument specifically against metaethical moral relativism. So he wants to argue that the truth of that position, the truth of metaethical moral relativism, has implications that we find unlikely to be true, that its truth would imply things that clearly seem false. So if we assumed that it was true, the consequences would be things that we think are false, and hence we should reject metaethical moral relativism because of its likely false implications. So the name of this kind of argument dates all the way back to the Middle Ages or before. It's a Latin term. It's called reductio ad absurdum, loosely translated reduction from absurdity. And the idea behind this argument strategy is pretty straightforward. If you assume that something is true, and then from that assumption you derive things that seem to be false, then you should go back and reject that original assumption. So a real simple case like that would be, suppose we assume that it's raining. And we say, look, if it's raining, then we shouldn't be able to see the sun. But we look out the window and we see the sun. So we should then go back and reject that original assumption because it doesn't look like it's a plausible supposition that it's raining, given that that would imply something that we know to be false. So that's the idea behind reductio ad absurdum. If you can derive something that you know is false from a set of assumptions or premises, then you should reject one or more of those premises. And this is what Rachel tries to do. So Rachel suggests or argues that if we assume metaethical moral relativism is true, it has three implications that we find intuitively likely to be false, that we suspect can't possibly be true, that contradict deeply held beliefs we have about the nature of morality. And what are those three implications? Well, if metaethical moral relativism is true, Rachel argues, then there wouldn't be any intercultural moral normativity. So if two cultures disagree about something, they have a different moral judgment with regard to infanticide or premarital sexual relationships or funerary practices, right? There couldn't be any intercultural normativity that would bring you to consensus. Right? There couldn't be any rational arguments that would sway one side or the other towards consensus. And why is that? Well, those moral codes, according to this view, are dictated by moral values, what makes them true or false, what makes the judgments about infanticide or premarital sexual relationships or funerary practices true or false is intrinsic to the culture itself. And so talking about the truth or falsity of those judgments detached from the cultural context in which they're made doesn't make any sense. And hence, trying to talk about it being true in another culture based on the suppositions of your culture doesn't make any sense. So there couldn't be any intercultural moral normativity, no way to sway people rationally, no way to come to consensus about a truth of a moral judgment because the truths are all relativized to cultures. Likewise, there couldn't be any intercultural, within cultural moral disagreement. So what counts as the correct moral judgment is determined by the consensus, the moral values, the practices, the conventions, and so on within that society. And so there isn't any room in this view for someone within a society to say, look, this is morally wrong. That doesn't make any sense. Their moral judgment would be in conflict with the values, the practices, and the conventions of that culture, and hence it couldn't make any sense of them saying that their judgment is true and the society's judgment is false. Their judgment would be always judged to be false. Finally, there couldn't be any sense of moral progress or reform if metaethical moral relativism is true. So, for example, we think that moral progress has been made. Laws have been reformed to reflect ethical truths when we made legal prohibitions against slavery. So It's illegal to own slaves in the United States, in most countries around the world, in fact, and that's considered to be moral progress. It's reform of laws to reflect a real moral truth. However, if what counts as a moral truth is relative to the practices and the values of a culture, then I'm sure the practices could change, but there would be no sense of progress or reform, because at one point in time, slavery would be judged to be morally good. And then we'd have a change of practices, and then it would be judged to be morally bad. But there wouldn't be a sense of progress, a recognition of a truth that was true all along. It was true slavery was good earlier, and it is false that slavery is good later. These are judgments that are made relative to the times or relative to the cultures, and so they can't be said to be recognizing something that was true all along. The reforms are made to reflect the nature of the real moral status of slavery. But in all of these cases, like the moral progress case, we find those consequences to be profoundly unintuitive. They go against our basic beliefs about how morality and ethics work in society. And so Rachel says, since they follow from the assumption of metaethical moral relativism, and we think that they are false, then we should reject metaethical moral relativism. So we have reasons to suppose that metaethical moral relativism is false. Those reasons are it has consequences that we think are false, and hence it's probably false. So insofar as we find these consequences too extreme or unintuitive, they go against deeply held beliefs, we think that they are false, Rachel says we should reject metaethical moral relativism. So that's the end of this lecture. In the next lecture series, we'll turn to the doctrine of egoism in ethics and psychology.